Good morning, everyone. I see that attendees are joining. Welcome to this webinar. We will be waiting for people to join and start 1 or 2 minutes past. So good morning. We are 1 minute past 10 CET. So I will slowly kick off this webinar. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today. Good morning, good evening, afternoon, depending on where you are based in the world. My name is Marie Gustafsson, and I'm a managing consultant at South Pole in Stockholm, leading our team of 6 people in Stockholm. I am one of your hosts today, and we are delighted to have so many people attending. The subject of this session is low carbon supply chains, and we have a panel of distinguished speakers who then also will be able to respond to questions in the following Q&A. So I will first give some introductory information, and then I will hand over to our host of the day, who is Naomi. And then first, there are some housekeeping rules. As attendees, you are all on mute at the moment. If you do have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to submit them through the question box in the control panel. If you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know and we'll do the best to solve that. We also aim to respond to all questions that you may post after the webinar, but as we have quite a lot of attendees, we may not get around to all questions. However, this webinar is being recorded and will be circulated within around a week, together with a link to download the slides afterwards. Last but not least, we are broadcasting from home still, many of us, so please bear with us in case there are any technical difficulties. And we have scheduled this webinar to go on until 11:30 CT today, but that will be slightly flexible depending on the Q&A session towards the end. So welcome everyone, and before introducing our first speakers, I will spend one slide on the Nordic Platform for Mobilizing Climate Finance, which is the framework for this webinar series. The Nordic Platform is an initiative from the Nordic Council of Ministers and is coordinated by us at South Pole. The initiative stays based on the Helsinki Principles and the Nordic Vision of 2030, and the ultimate goal of the platform is to highlight areas where Nordic cooperation can support the road towards climate neutrality. And what the platform does is hosting a long series of webinars where organizations and corporates can share experiences and challenges and provide inspiration to other fellow actors on sustainability topics. And in the end, it will also distill into recommendations for the Nordic governments, and therefore the questions that you were asked as part of the registration. I will come back to that a little bit later today. So yeah, this is the second webinar on the corporate side. Information on all this and much more is available on our homepage, which I recommend you to visit. And with this introduction, I will hand over to our moderator of the day, who is Naomi.
So good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone joining. It's my pleasure to be with you here today. I'll be moderating this event today, and I'll just start off with a quick introduction about myself, about South Pole, and about our team, so to contextualize everything that we're going to speak about. So firstly, about myself, my name is Naomi Rosenthal. I'm leading our sustainable supply chains practice at South Pole. The team is a global team, and what we do is we help make sustainable supply chains a reality for our companies, clients, and partners. A quick overview on South Pole. So South Pole is one of the leading providers of sustainability solutions globally. We have offices in over 19 different countries around the world with 350 excited environmental professionals supporting clients to bring climate action to life. Our expertise covers advisory and data, such as sustainability risks and opportunities, as well as developing and implementing concrete action programs such as carbon credits or renewable energy certificates. So I'll say a few words also about our work as a team. So as a team, we help companies, especially consumer goods companies, navigating complexity in the supply chain. So as you all know, to get sustainable supply chains to be a reality really means working across a broad range of different stakeholder requirements, in transparency, challenges along the supply chains, various tiers of suppliers. And what we do is we help to navigate that complexity by helping companies to understand how to address that through three concrete ways. The first one is that we help companies understand their environmental risks and impacts, so really what is going on in the supply chain. We then help companies to design strategies to address those different identified risk and opportunity hotspots. And finally, implementing concrete projects and programs such as insetting, which helps companies to reduce their environmental impacts in the supply chain and also work towards net zero. So without further ado, I would like to kick us off by introducing Louisa Smith. So we'll have a number of different speakers. Maybe I can briefly touch on that. So we have Louisa Smith joining us from Lego. We have Rebecca Johansson from Helly Hansen, Morten Storgard from Novo Nordisk, Jatta Kastonen from Posti, and Hannele Jövela from Stora Enso. So Louisa Smith is a senior manager of environmental supply chain at Lego, and she's going to give us a high-level picture of sustainable supply chains and dive us into what it means to do supply chain mapping. Louisa, over to you.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Hi, everybody. So my name's Louise Smith and I work for the Lego Group. My role is particularly focused on managing environmental supply chains, but as I'm going to go into in this presentation, I do work with other teams who consider some of the social risks in supply chains as well. And I think it's worth noting that we have quite a big complex program, and what I'm talking about today is purely going all the way back to where you start, how you map out what suppliers you're going to work with and how you're going to work with them. So I think it's some of it is not rocket science and it might feel quite obvious, but I think getting to that first step of tackling how you manage a supply chain towards sustainability can feel quite daunting. So this part of this small presentation I'm going to give is just going to give an outline of sort of how you start that off and start to pull apart that complexity so that you can tackle it. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? Brilliant, thank you. So at the Lego Group, we're quite lucky. We have a reasonably shallow supply chain, around 6,000 suppliers, which I know is very small, probably compared to some people on the call. And a lot of our suppliers are raw materials. So things like resin, of course, that makes the little Lego man that you'll see there, and some cardboard for our boxes. So in that respect, we're quite lucky, but still 6,000 suppliers, that's a lot. It's a lot of environmental impact. Some of it's quite high impact categories. So we still needed to look at that and sort of pull apart that complexity and think about how to manage our supply chain towards the most impactful sustainable management. So we have two teams. One team is responsible sourcing. They've been at the Lego Group for around, or set up sort of over 15 years now. And that's because historically we had a real interest in ensuring that there were no labour rights or child labour in our supply chain. As you can understand, that's very important to a company like the Lego Group. It's important to all companies, but it was something that quite a long time ago we recognised was a real risk for us and something we just didn't want to allow. The environmental side came in a bit later. So environmental supply chain, we started looking at that around 5 years ago. And that was initially a partnership between us, WWF and CDP. And that was because WWF challenged us to start looking at our emissions beyond scope 1 and 2 in our own operations and started challenging us to work on our scope 3 upstream supply chain emissions. So we have to ensure, and I think this is very important, I don't work in isolation. I'm the only environmental supply chain person at the moment, but I do not work in isolation. I work very closely with the social responsible sourcing team and the procurement team. And the reason for that is because we didn't want to get to a position where we were not focusing on some of the social risks at the expense of the environmental risks. And we felt that went very hand in hand. So we try really hard to map social risks and environmental risks alongside one another and give them equal importance, because we just don't want things to drop off. We're at the point now where we categorize suppliers at each stage. So when we begin a sourcing event for a new supplier, we consider environmental and social considerations. When we put contracts in place, we again consider it, and then depending on the supplier throughout the supplier relationship management process, we also make sure we're talking to them about social and environmental expectations. Okay, great. Can we go to the next slide? Brilliant. So the approach we took to mapping our supply chain, again, as I say, it's really not rocket science, but I think it helps to pull apart some of that complexity, because we aren't huge teams. Even though we're the Lego Group, I'm sure lots of people on this call are in the same position, that there aren't enormous numbers of people able to do this. So we had to prioritize. So we took an approach, a risk approach, which is pretty standard, but I think works and gets you to the sort of being able to prioritize based on social and labour risks. So that's particularly thinking about where we've got high risks in the country of origin of some of those raw materials, high risk in the industries. So again, industries like resin that are can be quite dirty, high carbon intensity and challenging industries. We recognise those. Areas where there are, or industries where there are less legal protections or controls are prioritised, because that's really important. And then where we see in businesses a real lack of CSR or sustainability programs at all, a real lack of consideration for social and environmental risk, that's highlighted as sort of a high social labour risk area as well. And on my side, on the environmental side, of course, high carbon emissions are right up there. But in addition to that, we also think about significant local emissions, because in some cases, we might be producing something that's not particularly carbon intensive, but is produced in a place and in a way that leads to high air pollution for local communities. Of course, use of materials that require mining or extraction, so oil, precious metals, materials that have high forest-based commodities, high water use in production, and significant waste created in production. And this list isn't exhaustive. this is just to give you an idea of some of the risks that we're looking for when we categorize our supply chain to help us manage it. Okay, can we jump to the next one? Perfect. So this table, and again, this is very simple, but to make sure that we are tackling our supply chain in a way that is manageable and is impactful, we look at some of those specific social and labour risks, or all of those specific social and labour risks, and those specific environmental risks alongside one another, depending on how high the level of risk is. So for example, all of our resin suppliers would be high environmental risk and predominantly high social and labour risk as well. So they are categorised as category A. And a category A supplier, what that means is somebody like me and somebody from the responsible sourcing team will be involved from the first stage when there's a sourcing event. And that means everything from, there are questions when a new supplier applies to work with Lego that they have to complete and tell us about what they're doing on social and environmental areas, and tell us about how they're making sure they're managing that risk. There's a second stage where they are interviewed by me and interviewed by responsible sourcing. There's a third stage where they're on a panel and I'm on the panel and responsible sourcing are on the panel alongside teams like quality and pricing and finance. So they have to talk about these social and environmental considerations at every stage. They get scored on that basis and we get a percentage of the scoring. So we're still, I know some companies have got to a clarity about the weighting that this is given, and it has varied a little bit for us so far, but we're somewhere between 5 and 20% on these high risk categories when they come into the company. So after that sourcing stage where we've been heavily involved, they're then enrolled onto our social audit program, which means they're consistently and regularly audited to ensure that they're meeting the social conditions that we expect. And that's all outlined in what most companies would call a code of conduct, but we call a responsible business principles document that they have to contractually sign up to. And then they are also enrolled in my program, which is Engage to Reduce. And that means they have to annually report their climate impacts, and they have to annually tell me about how they're managing their emissions, but also, if it's relevant, their forest-based commodities impacts and their water impacts. So I end up with a lot of data and we push them through that program, which is focused on continual improvement. So anybody in category A, that's quite heavy engagement, and that requires a team and that requires people with expertise. The reason we set it out to these three categories is because it would be impossible for us to do that level of engagement at every single stage. So category B, we are pulled in to advise the procurement team, and the procurement team have all been trained and guided into how to do this as well. But of course, there are some things they might not know the answer to, and that's where they, on a category B supplier, they can come to us and they can ask questions and they can loop us in if they need to. But I will not necessarily be involved fully in that process at every stage. The suppliers will have to answer questions on these things when they come into the Lego group, and again, I might be asked to quickly look over them, but I won't be asked to interview them. So it's kind of more an ad hoc support of all of those category B suppliers. And then category C, we're talking very low environmental risk. So this might be the service industry where we perhaps have a small contract or a piece of legal work, something that is low impact on a social and environmental side. And in that, it's over to procurement based on the training that they've already had to decide how to manage that. So those category C suppliers are self-serve, and that's very much what we're doing in that category, is really empowering the procurement team as much as possible to be able to manage that for themselves. And what this means is that based on this risk profile, we can ensure that any high-risk suppliers are getting as full an overview and are really engaged with us as much as possible on environmental and social risks. But we can also empower procurement to start making those decisions, and it means that we can have touch points with every single supplier in a way that is not overwhelming and is something that we can actually do properly. And I think I wanted to share this as sort of a first step of how to approach it, because I know some people on this call will have been looking at a supply chain of 10,000, 30,000 suppliers and thinking, how do you even start? And I think this categorization and breaking it down and establishing what support and how you can manage it at each stage is a really important way to do that. Can we jump on to the next slide, please? And so this is just sort of the final point, and the key point is that I think from my perspective as the environmental supply chain person, a real turning point for me was recognizing that it's impossible to do on my own, and that actually when I work with procurement and the responsible sourcing team, it's really important to pull all those things together, and that's the best way to sort of map and tackle.
Welcome again, wherever you are from. Currently, I'm based in the Netherlands. My name is Ingmar Schuurmans, and I will be together with Mikko Halonen, your moderator for today. So what we'll
So that was a somewhat unexpected interaction. Louise, can you please continue?
Sure. Yeah, I was just closing up to say that I think when you're looking at an overwhelmingly large supply chain, the best way to do it is to really engage and empower procurement as much as possible, to work with other expertise in the company, to always make sure, for me personally, and I think for the Lego group, ensuring that that social as well as environmental side of things are considered with equal weight, to make sure that you don't end up accidentally focusing on one side more than the other. And we find that works really well, this sort of collaborative model. So that's the way that the Lego group has tackled this mapping, is to bring these three teams together to really work on it. So thank you. That was the end of my presentation, and thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was an excellent presentation. I really appreciated to see how Lego is, on the one side, really thinking through prioritization critically, which is so important when we think about, supply chains with thousands of suppliers. Yeah. And of course, the second thing being this integration and collaboration between various teams, which is essential for driving action. So thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
I have the pleasure now of introducing you all to Rebecca Johansson, who is the Sustainability and R&D Manager at Helly Hansen. And Rebecca is going to dive us into an example from their supply chain, from the Helly Hansen supply chain, that illustrates how to tackle complexity and how to really take action in the supply chain. Rebecca, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction. Great. So I think we can move to the second slide directly, since you already introduced me. So perfect. Very shortly about who Helly Hansen are. I'm not going to deep dive into our history of 140 plus years here. So just, shortly, we are a brand which is founded in Norway by a sea captain called Hel Hansen. And we have a history of product innovation in both construction and new materials, and I would say that that is really kind of core to who we are. If you move to the next slide. In short, we make professional grade gear, mainly apparel for outdoor activities such as skiing, sailing, hiking, but also professionals in ski resorts and workwear for construction areas, etc. So those professional partnerships are very important to us and really kind of key to the brand. If we move to the next slide. Since time is quite short today, I thought we just jump directly into the topic here. I would like to spend some time on looking at the complexity of the textile supply chain by using one of our sailing jackets here as an example to illustrate that. It's actually one of our most popular styles, which is called the crew jackets. And it's made here in the south of Bangladesh. I've been trying to pinpoint the area there, but if you see a little yellow dot, that's where the jacket is made. If you go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to, we can move to the next slide. I just want to highlight here how we are defining the different tiers in the textile and garment industry to follow the presentation. So tier 1 would be our garment producers, and then upstream we have textile producers, yarn, and raw materials. Then we can move on. So this is a screenshot of the bill of materials for this jacket. All components going into making the product is listed here. So in total we have 43 different items which are kind of sewn or put together to make the final product. And as you can see here in the red marked column, these materials are not all coming from Bangladesh. We have quite a few from China. We also have some materials from Taiwan. Some of the items here will be from Bangladesh, but I think it's the zippers here, which are from YKK, so that would be a different facility and not the assembling facility. So if we go to the next slide, I would like to deep dive into one of these materials. And we now see here that to make this one line in the bill of material, if we go back to tier 3, we actually need to involve 4 different facilities. So first we are spinning the yarn outside of Taipei. The yarn is then transported to a weaving facility where we make the actual textile. Then it's transported to a dyeing facility where they're adding the color. And at last, we are laminating the textile with a waterproof and breathable membrane before it can be shipped off to Bangladesh to make the garment. So behind each item of the bill of material, we have a similar upstream supply chain, which is obviously adding many more manufacturing steps, mills, countries than this country of origin, which you usually see in the inside your garments. So then we can move to the next slide. So then how to capture the full carbon footprint of a complex supply chain. It's obviously very challenging. We calculated our carbon footprint in 2019 for the first time, including scope 3. We have used quite high level impact data for materials, and with those data sets applied, over 90% of our corporate carbon footprint is linked to making the product. So raw material production, textile manufacturing, and assembling. So in order to reduce our impact, we really have to work back in the supply chain and try to measure as granular as we can and really work closely with our partners to reduce as much as possible. So then if we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so the footprint calculation we conduct this was done via a tool called the Higg Index. And it's the apparel and industry via the Sustainable Apparel Coalition who has developed this tool, which is measuring the environmental footprint of apparel and textile. And it's not only considering carbon. This tool is also looking at our environmental parameters such as water scarcity and chemistry and so on. We can go to the next slide. I'm not going to go into depth of the tool, but I just wanted to highlight here that it's consisting of 3 main parts, where the product tool contains of a material database where we have access to generic environmental impact data for textiles. Well, the facility tool, the facility environmental module, which is a part of that, is looking at the actual environmental performance of facilities. I think we have an example of in the next slide. So here, for example, we have the scoring via Higg in the garment manufacturer in Bangladesh. So here we can really see where they're doing a really good job on environmental management and energy, for example, why we need to improve on the air emission part. So this is now a self-assessment, but that can also be verified via a third party. If you go to the next slide, here we have an assessment done by the dyeing factory and the laminator. So this really enables us to have comparable data between different facilities in our supply chain. It's also supporting the manufacturers because they don't have to conduct several different environmental assessments for their customers. They are conducting this one assessment, and then that is shared via the Higg platform with many other customers. If we go to the next one, so yeah, this is just to support other research, and reports are also supporting this, that the largest chunk of carbon is really coming from extracting the raw materials and making the textiles and products. Yes, so the above one was from Qantas, but here I would like to underline that when we know all this environmental burden which is required to make our garments, And here we haven't even talked about the time and effort from humans to put those garments together. It's just very obvious that we have to move from this linear approach to a circular one, where we really aim to keep the products and materials on its highest value at all time. So I think we can move to the next slide, please. So at last, then I would like to look at what I think can support to kind of accelerate the transition towards a circular, low carbon apparel industry. And I'm going to begin by jumping out in a quite deep water here. To make a vote for put more tax on pollution and in favor to lower the tax on labor. The current linear business model comes with a massive external cost, as we know. It's from fossil fuels, fresh waters, fertilizers. The textile industry is quite intense on those parameters. This is not at all reflected in the final cost of the product. So, but obviously greenhouse gas emissions and water use and so on cannot continue to be free of charge. So we are looking at how we can develop a more circular supply chain. This will take time and effort, and it will be more labor intense if we're going to start taking back the products on a local base. We have to take them back, what we put out on the market, enable repair, make a repair more accessible, refurbish them, sorted textiles for recycling, and then recycle all the garments or textiles that we're putting out on the garment. So if resources were more expensive, I believe that we would also kind of take better care of them, which would again boost the circular economy. Staying out here on the deep water, I've added a sentence there. I don't know much about climate policy, I must say, but when we know that most of the pollution is happening in the production countries, it seems logic that we also have some kind of border adjustment mechanism to ensure that that pollution is captured in the products imported to our key markets. Second, we need transparency. The textile supply chain is, as I showed, very complex and many times quite opaque. The only way to reduce our environmental footprint is really by having traceable and transparent supply chains. We need to ensure that we are driving reducing with real data and not only using this generic data sets, which might not reflect the reality. At last point, we also need to invest in scaling all available technologies which are out there for sorting textiles, recycling them back to new materials. We will also need the countries to build the infrastructure, making that possible for taking back and collecting garments and textiles. On top of that, we need to enable repair and reuse already from design stage, but also making it accessible and convenient. We have a bit of work to do here when it comes to consumer education as well. Just wanted to add that as a last point. We really need to communicate better and change the mindset that people are really thinking first if you can repair the product before you throw it away and buy a new one, to always keep the materials and products on its highest level. Thank you. I think that was it from my side.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This was a very good presentation and really shows, the complexity, where to start and how incredible amount of resources, both environmental and people, goes into making the jackets and other products that we love. And it's great to see how you've mapped that out and then really thought through how to address each of the different challenges related to that and how to accelerate the transition there. So thank you, Rebecca. I'd now like to introduce you all to Morten Storgaard. He is the Global Project Lead for Corporate Environmental Strategy at Novo Nordisk. Morten is going to introduce us to how some learnings that Novo Nordisk has actually made in terms of driving changes within the supply chain and how to really engage with suppliers. So Morten, over to you.
Thank you, Naomi. I think you can just move to the next slide that you just kindly introduced me. So just briefly, Novo Nordisk, we are a healthcare company headquartered in Denmark. We have a global manufacturing setup spread out across the world. We are mainly famous for our insulin production. For instance, in Kalundborg, Denmark, we are producing 50% of the world's volume in insulin. But we also have we're also producing other products such as hemophilia products and obesity products and so on. So if you can move to the next slide, I'm going to talk to you about our environmental strategy and how we engage with suppliers. And in Novo Nordisk, we have our Circular for Zero strategy, which says that zero impact is our ambition. So that means that in everything that we do in our daily operations to our strategic projects, we need to aim for zero environmental impact. And that goes for if you're working in R&D or production or in IT or in an office-based building, every employee has to take their part in this journey. So this is an ambition level. I think it's bold and very ambitious. There is no time tag approach to it, but that's because we have defined 7 strategic tracks as part of our Circular for Zero strategy. So if you can move to the next slide. In Novo Nordisk, we have decided to focus on 3 strategic pillars. We have the circular supply that we will talk about today. We also have, of course, our focus on our company called Circular Company. And then we also, as a fairly new thing, looking at the environmental performance of our products. So we also want to design and produce circular products. We are building on the principles of circular economy, which basically means that we are design our products so they can be recovered or recycled, so they can be produced into new pens. We are also, of course, we should reduce our consumption of raw materials and resources across the value chain. And also, very importantly, we are looking at every option to turn waste into new resources. So basically, in a circular world, there's no things as such as a waste. So as again, we have 3 pillars here, and if you move to the next slide, I will talk more about the projects, but also more specifically about the circular supply. We have 2 projects in the circular supply. One is called Reduce Supply Footprint. So that basically means that we are looking at our environmental impact from our suppliers and their suppliers and so on. We have defined a target. It was actually launched last month that we want all our suppliers to be based on 100% renewable power. So we have 60,000 suppliers in Novo Nordisk, and that means that all of them has to produce with renewable power. We have a second track called circular procurement, and that really goes, whereas the track number 1 is linked to the operations of the suppliers, then track number 2 is the products that they are and the services they are delivering to us. So we want them, both the services and products, to be more circular than they are today. I will not dig so much into the remaining projects in interest of time, but I will just highlight that we also have, as part of project number 3, we have a carbon neutral target for all of our operations, so scope 1 and 2 operations. And in that target, we also have distribution, so product distribution, and also our business flights that needs to go to 0 emissions by 2030. So moving on to the next slide, I can tell you a bit more about our supply chain impact. This is a picture. So if looking at the slide here, we can see that 80% of our carbon emissions actually come from our supply chain. This was, I think it was 5 years ago we realized this, and it was a huge surprise to us. I sense that most companies has this eye-opener feeling now and then. But so we have worked with supply chain engagement for the past 5 years, and now we have set this ambitious target that all suppliers must produce with renewable power. So it basically tells that we need to look beyond our own operations to address the bulk of our CO2 emissions. So moving on to the next slide, I can tell you exactly how we are addressing that. This is a very process-heavy slide, but I hope that you bear with me. we are engaging suppliers on 2 levels as part of our program called Suppliers for Zero. And we want them to purchase renewable power for the services and goods that they produce to us. So if you are an existing supplier, then you follow the first 4 steps here. Basically, we are selecting what we refer as key suppliers. We have around 300 suppliers in Novo Nordisk, which account for 80% of the supply chain emissions. That is a very good place to start. We do that based on life cycle assessment indicators and volume data. And then when we have this knowledge, we engage these suppliers and try to tell them our own journey. We have, for instance, powered our global manufacturing setup with 100% renewable power. They can chip into those learnings. We can teach them about that. They can maybe teach us about something else in terms of product packaging, in terms of water usage, and so on. So we are sharing a bit knowledge. So it's very important to say it's a very collaborative approach that we are applying here for the suppliers, and they actually appreciate that. Some of them we are talking with. So once we enroll these key suppliers into our program, we want to get it a bit more crisp. So we need to have commitments from the suppliers that they are actually improving environmental performance. So together with the suppliers, we are compiling a roadmap together with them, both of course linking to the renewable power, but also linking to the water usage, to the waste, to the product design, and so on. Of course, depending on which suppliers we are talking with. And those suppliers we follow up with on an annual basis, and of course they need to document that they are doing continuous improvements. So that is so we are, for the existing suppliers, we collaborate to increase the renewable power capacity and to reduce the other environmental impacts from suppliers. With new suppliers, we basically have a very pragmatic approach. Since we have 60,000 suppliers to address, we put that into to sourcing events such as a tender or a renegotiation. So we use so we basically say to the suppliers, are you using renewable power? And if not, are you willing to commit to using 100% renewable power for Novo Nordisk? And that goes into the supplier selection, so it gets weighed as a minimum 10%. And building on that, we embed that into our contract. So this is a part of our Novo Nordisk standard contract right now. Of course, you need to produce with renewable power, and if not, you have to explain, or basically you get deselected over time. So that's our approach. Right now, we have some very good learnings I would like to share with you on the next slide. So basically, it's three key learnings. I have a lot of learnings, but if I have to sum it down to 3, I would say organizational embedding is crucial in this area. I think Eloise from Lego also mentioned this. It's so important that the environmental team is aligned with the various procurement teams and sourcing teams, with the supply manager, and actually also with the suppliers procurement teams. So this is very crucial to get a streamlined organization. This is very anchored in procurement. So this our program is actually owned by our procurement units. We have 3 units in Novo Nordisk, depending on which items that you're buying. But this needs to be owned by them and driven by them. The second thing is, you can also argue, why are we focusing on renewable power? It's basically because we can see, based on our experience, we can see that this is the single most effective way to cut down your CO2 emissions. Of course, you still need to do energy saving projects. Of course, you still need to do other good things for the CO2 emissions, but renewable power is simply a great way to reduce your emissions very drastically. So we have taken an approach where we keep it simple. We say to suppliers, this is what we expect of you as a minimum. And of course, we are willing to share and collaborate with other environmental aspects, for instance, water optimizations and recycling. But we keep it simple, and this is quite well received from suppliers. We can see that there's just an add-on learning here. We can see that there is actually a perceived cost, so to say, in the market. So suppliers think, well, renewable power? Well, we don't have the capex to invest in big windmills in our backyard or whatever they need to say. And that, of course, is a huge investment, but we see renewable power prices going very much down, and this is a perfect time to invest now and also to meet our demands, of course. So it's a good place to start, and it's a very good, effective way of cutting CO2 emissions. The last learning here, Novo Nordisk, we have 60,000 suppliers. Some suppliers we basically do not have any leverage, but with some suppliers we do have leverage. And that also dependent on your local presence. In Denmark, we are a big company. We are by market value, we are famous in Europe. So people know our brand and our name, but in other regions we might not be that appealing to be attached to our brand. So it's really about taking or focusing on the key suppliers. We think we have the ability to influence suppliers here. Then let's move on with them. Let's collaborate with them. Let's move them in the right direction and accelerate our decarbonization, our supply chain. So leverage is just important. And also when I speak with our procurement teams, this is one of the very key things to consider when engaging a supplier. That was more or less it for me. And yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Thanks so much, Martin. Really appreciated your presentation, and your learnings, I think, are very insightful for others. What struck me was, how very clear you were in terms of with the suppliers regarding their requirements, giving them one very clear KPI to pursue, keeping that simple and making it, really clear what the consequences could be if they don't move forward with that. So thank you very much for your presentation. I'm looking forward also for including this presentation and of course all the others at the Q&A at the end of our session. But for now, I'll hand over to Marie, who will give us a short intervention.
Yes, hi again. So the key objective of the Nordic platform is to share knowledges, but also to gather feedback to the governments, what role they can play and how they can assist in the transition to low carbon supply chains. This is why we asked you, as part of your registration, to give your opinion on this. So even if we had almost 200 people registering, we had around 50 answers on this question, so to be taken with a grain of salt. Yet there was a majority of the respondents saying that there is a role, and I put out a couple of quotes and comments that were provided as part of the registration, in terms of that the Nordic governments could set supply chain standards and use that to drive up the standards across the economy, or that the governments can encourage better supply chain engagement and support, for instance, agriculture producers in transition finance. On the more skeptical side, there was a comment on that no, the governments don't really have a role, but taxation should cover supply chains as well as taxation imports on carbon. We are very curious to hear, receive other feedbacks and comments on this. So yeah, they are very welcome to be posted in the question box. But without further ado, I will hand over to Posti and Jatta, who will present their work with sustainable supply chains.
Hello, thank you, Mary. So my name is Jatta Kosonen, I'm the head of quality and environment at Posti. And yes, go ahead for the next slide. So just in the beginning, brief introduction of Posti. So Posti is a logistics service providing company operating in 8 countries with over 22,000 employees. And we are actually owned by the state of Finland. And of course, the main market for us is in Finland. Please go ahead for the next slide. This is just briefly introducing what kind of services we provide. So we are very strong on the parcel and e-commerce side. We do a lot of postal service deliveries. We are working in the warehousing and in-house logistics side, and also on the freight services. So many different services and on the logistic area. Please go ahead for the next. I think we were here. Yes. So of course, as with the common where we are heading, so Posti is very much focusing on the growth on the parcel and e-commerce and also in the logistic solutions. And we actually this week opened the 2000th parcel locker in Helsinki and in Finland. And we can say now that 85% of Finns can actually collect their parcels within 1 kilometer from their home, and that's the aim and where we are heading for with our network. And we want to be very close with the consumers and with our customers with the expanded network we have. And just one number that I think gives also a lot of information on how we are working and what we are doing is that we actually visit around 3 million households and companies every weekday. So we are all around in Finland and very much providing services there. So please, I think we can go for the next. So just briefly that we at Posti have been carbon neutral since 2011 in our postal deliveries. And as a total company in Finland, we have been carbon neutral since 2015. And of course, that's through our environmental program and voluntary carbon offsetting. We put sustainability in the core of our work, of course, and we belong to the best of 1% of the companies in EcoVadis assessment, and follow through, of course, the international standards on the quality, environment, and health and safety management systems. We can go for next, thank you. But of course, this is not enough. As we all know, carbon neutral is really important. We have to work on the offsetting side also. But we have now set a very ambitious target for ourselves, and we are aiming now for 0 emissions in our own operations by 2030. So quite similar target as Novo Nordisk has. And that's something that is now really much guiding our work on this side. And we are also committed to the Science-Based Target Initiative. And our next step is now to approve our climate targets in accordance with the 1.5 degrees pathway. And of course, we are also very much looking into the net zero guidelines and what will come with that in the SBTi world. I think we can go for the next. So what it actually means for us, and as we are a service providing company and not a product company, so how we see this total. We have actually just finalized our new baseline after Scope 3 analysis. And we can see that we actually doubled the value chain emissions at Posti after the analysis as we added new categories into the emissions. And we can say that 25% of our emissions are from our own direct emissions. And as we are a transportation logistic company, the main part is, of course, the fuel consumption that we have in our vehicles. And the second big part for us is the facilities and the energy consumption on that side. So those are the things in our own emissions we are focusing heavily now on. But when we look for the value chain and also for the supply chain, it looks a bit different than for the product companies. But for us also, the value chain part is the biggest part of our emissions. So 75%, and half of that is from the transportation and distribution in upstream. So our suppliers, our contract companies, which we are using in our supply chain and logistic chain, is the main part of the emissions. And there we need to really, we have been doing for years the supply engagement part, but that is something we need to focus on the future also very much on. And then the other categories also added on the purchased goods and services and capital goods, and of course fuel and energy related activities. But want to highlight also the employee commuting part, and as we are a big employer, I think we have a big impact we can make on the people's lives and from the commuting side. So that's what it looks like for Posti. So when we want to impact the emissions, this is what we have, where we have to work on heavily. Please go ahead. And what it means for our own side, of course, our own footprint and on our direct emissions, we can do the decision, and it's easy, not easy, but we are in charge of deciding what we do and where we do. So for this year, we actually started to use renewable diesel in our own parcel last mile fleet, and that's a quite big step for us forward on this. We are also investing on the truck fleet, so bringing on 10 new liquefied biogas trucks this year, and approaching to 16 gas trucks as a total fleet. We have also been a lot focusing on the electricity side on the postal deliveries. So at the moment we have 38% of Finnish households that we are reaching with electricity already now, and that's what we are aiming to increase a lot in the future. We use 100% renewable electricity in Finland and have done a lot on the energy reduction side. And also one really important topic for us from our transportations and also from the subcontractor side is the route optimization, to make sure that we do everything as smoothly as possible to reduce or not to have extra emissions from that side. Please, let's take the next. As said, 75% of our emissions are from the value chain part, and also as a service providing company, the supply chain part is a bit different for us because we have most of the partners quite close to us, as they are also providing services to our customers. So for us, it's a lot of collaboration, it's a lot of partnership mentality, how to make the difference and how to make change on this field. And this is, I listed here how we are approaching this topic. As said, 75% of our emissions are from value chain, and 50% of those are from the distribution and transportation side. And of course, first inviting our partners in this journey, so helping them to understand that we are very ambitious on this topic and to inviting them on board. Of course, helping our partners in moving towards more sustainable solutions. We are a big logistic company, and we have a lot of knowledge that we can share, and also other things that we can help with our partners, and we want to be there as a collaborating partner. Of course, we need to prefer the low emission solutions and the good partners in a way. So we cannot take the steps to the wrong direction. So we have to, in a way, pay attention where we are going. One of the very important things, and I think I'm learning also from our side, is that we need to really challenge the way we are doing at the moment. With the zero emission target, it's really ambitious, and you have to find new ways of doing things. And this usually means a wide collaboration, not just with the partners and suppliers, but also with the customer side, to really find out the best ways of doing things. And one important topic also, that we should include the emission and other parameters that we prefer into the business parameters, so that we don't have it as an extra, but it's already there, and we can see where we are going and what's the impact of the decisions that we make. Let's go for the next last slide. So just to summarize, what we are aiming for is, of course, to minimize the negative footprint, and by doing it with our own investments, but also helping and partnering with our partners in the supply chain to make a difference. And also the other side is to maximize the handprint, enable more sustainable choices for growth. And for example, for us, it's the sustainable online shopping that we boost. And with our parcel network, I think we can make it very wise decisions for the emission side also too. Even though the e-commerce side is growing fastly, I think we can make a difference there. And that's, I think, it from my side. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jasta. Yeah, I very much enjoyed your conversation. Sorry, coughing a little bit. And And in particular, I really appreciated the fact that Posti is going beyond just looking at the footprint and really thinking about how to drive transformational change in the sector. And your zero carbon strategy for 2030 is, of course, very, very ambitious. So it's great to see that you're driving this zero carbon mission and at the same time really thinking through the handprint. So thank you very much for your presentation. Next, we will hear from Hannele Hirvela, who is the Sustainability Manager at Stora Enso. And Hannele will speak about the sustainable sourcing and supplier engagement in the wood sector. So looking forward to hearing more learnings from your industry, Hannele. Over to you.
Thank you. And hi to everyone from my part as well. I'm the last presenter today, so I'm trying to keep it short so we can get to the discussion part also. I will walk you through the different elements and tools that we use in driving low carbon supply chains at Stora Enso. And then I will focus a bit more on how we have harnessed our commercial tendering process to do this work. I think we can go to the next slide, please. So first, a couple of slides about Stora Enso, just to set the scene, as you might not be familiar with us as a company. So we produce and provide renewable solutions in packaging, biomaterials, wooden construction, and paper. And our motto really is that everything that is made from fossil-based materials today, such as coffee cups, can be made from a tree tomorrow. So we are offering really renewable, low carbon, and circular solutions to a world that needs to be more efficient with its resources. And then next slide, please. And a few more facts about us there. So we are a global company with operations in all continents. We're listed in both Sweden and Finland. And maybe to focus a bit more on our topic today, so our sourcing and logistics has been centrally led function since 2014. But we still have quite a lot of global presence at our mills. And there are about 400 people working in sourcing and logistics at Stora Enso. And with this setup, we are then managing about 20,000 suppliers globally. And there, some of our biggest categories, sourcing categories, then include logistics, recycled paper and board, chemicals, and machinery. And then we have a team of 4 people working with sustainable sourcing. That might sound a lot, but with the level that we are working on, we're always struggling with the resources still. So I think we can go to the next slide and moving on to our sourcing activities through which we drive our climate work. And we have integrated all our sustainability elements into our general sourcing process, and that always follows pretty much the same protocol. And I feel that this kind of like well-defined sourcing activities and responsibilities that we have in Stora Enso and in our sourcing have really helped us to drive and embed the sustainable sourcing activities also and managing those. If we start with pre-qualifying our suppliers, we actually have a new supplier code of conduct that will be released in the beginning of next year. And that will for sure have even more strict requirements for reporting on environmental data. And of course, the supplier code of conduct, it's a legally binding document, part of all our contracts. So in that sense, it's really a starting point for our climate work, but a basic step, of course. Then as a next step, we are requiring all our suppliers to report their CO2 emissions as part of our tendering process. And this information is then used by our management to make really holistic sourcing decisions in our sourcing committees. And I will talk about this a bit more later then more. And also, of course, we have other data requests for our suppliers, for example, for LC life cycle assessment data that we can then also use to compare our suppliers' climate performance. Then we do a risk assessment for all our suppliers that's based on category and country, and this also includes climate parameters. And based on this risk assessment and mapping, then we target our monitoring activities such as audits and then deeper dives into certain supply chains. Then also not mentioned here, but one important activity or tool is the Scope 3 calculation, which we conduct biannually. And the calculation and analysis connected to it gives us, I feel, more visibility into the sourcing categories and raw materials on a very which have high emissions. So we get the information for that, and then we can aim reductions and possible substitution actions, for example, for certain categories or raw materials, and also guide our R&D process. Yep, let's move on to this next slide, and then go into the more hardcore climate commitments. So our science-based targets, and I'm sure that and many other companies do also quite a lot of good climate work with their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and they are kind of starting to be at the maximum almost, or requiring heavy investments to drive those emissions down. So also therefore we really need to put more pressure on lowering the Scope 3 emissions, especially the upstream ones that we are talking about here today. Our emissions along our value chain are 71% of all our emissions. So it's quite well aligned with the other presenters here today, actually. And then about 40% of that comes from sourcing and manufacturing of our raw materials and services. So really a big chunk. Our SBT target for our Scope 3 emissions is that 70% of our suppliers, in terms of spend, set their own GHG targets by 2025. And then as a starting point for that climate work, you can see the picture here on the right side. It's from our strategic supplier day in 2018, where we asked our suppliers if they have measured their emissions. And the result was with our strategic suppliers that about 80% have done this. So you can imagine what the result would have been with the 20,000 suppliers that we have. And we really want to drive change in the whole supplier base. So with these 20,000 suppliers, also with the small and medium-sized ones. So we decided to get them measuring then their emissions. So please to the next slide. So one of our biggest, or one of the main tools that we have at the moment in driving a low carbon supply chain has been the sustainability criteria in our tenders. Starting from 2018, we have asked all our suppliers to report their emissions, so Scope 1 and 2 emissions, as part of every tender. And this information is then visible in our sourcing tools. And we can evaluate that with the management when we make the sourcing decisions. And this was really a starting point for us in building climate awareness among our suppliers and urging them to start following and reducing their emissions. And as of today, we received the data in about 70% of our tenders, and which we think is actually quite good. But that didn't come with any pains. So we received all kinds of data from our suppliers, which wasn't correct, and a lot of requests from suppliers to help them reporting this. So really hands-on help for our suppliers. And also our own people in sourcing were sometimes struggling with this topic, and we had to put a lot of resources in training them also. But we have received a lot of good feedback from our suppliers, and I think they also feel that putting focus on CO2 performance in their operations is good for for their business and their opportunities in the future. And then next slide, please. And this is something that we tried then, because of course we know that there's a lot of data out there already on CO2, and to get the pay more from our organization as well, we wanted to try to automate it, and with existing data. So we use publicly available supplier CO2 data and to evaluate the footprints, and automated this data collection with search robotics and artificial intelligence, and then we were able to retrieve some of the CO2 data directly then into our system, so there wouldn't be the need to request this on every tender. However, that was well, somewhat success. So we got about from about 1,300 top suppliers, we got about 200 data back from this pilot. But we'll continue working on that to make it automated as well. And then to quickly summarize, so know your supply chain, where your emissions are coming from, map it and define, you know, which are the critical points and how you want to work on, what levels you want to work on are you working on multiple levels, and then really dare to drive change and start the work. It's big work, so like chuck down the elephant and start with the small pieces and just do it, pilot, and then go to perfection then later on. So those have been the ways that we have been working at in sourcing. Yeah, that was all from me. So thank you from my part.
Thank you so much, Hannele, for this very exciting presentation. It's great to see that Stora Enso is even actually moving into robotics and artificial intelligence for the monitoring. I mean, of course, monitoring is such an important part of sustainability, and for a lot of companies, it's quite onerous and can be quite expensive. So using digital solutions is a great way to move forward on that. And I think that's something that is definitely a theme that we will pick up during our Q&A. So thank you so much for that. So without further ado, we will actually now move into the question and answer part of this session. And I'd like to kick us off by asking the panelists something which is very important for the Nordic Council, and specifically, what role do you see for the Nordic governments to help facilitate low carbon supply chains? So I'll invite all our panelists to turn on their videos. And is there someone who would like to chime in first here and give a perspective from your organization? Otherwise, I can also ask for someone to chime in.
Maybe I can, as a service company, say a couple of words on this. So, of course, for us, when we look for the transportation and logistics side, it's really important to have, in a way, the taxation side to support the low emissions on transportations, and also what is really important is the investment side and the investment support on the green solutions. So I think those are the two main things that I see that there is a lot of power on the government side and also expectation maybe from the companies to have a positive development there.
I could add something from our perspective as well. So in EU, in the textile and also product industry, it's a work going on in regards to the new circular economy action plan, where they are looking at the product environmental footprint tool in order to kind of incentivize products which are produced the preferred environmental manufacturing processes or products. That is requiring a trustworthy methodology. So that is something which at least the textile industry has been starting to work on, to have one methodology which we can kind of put forward and say that this is something we can link back to our supply chain. But I think this part with making it financially attractive is it's important to accelerate it. So we can just do so much. But yeah, we need it to be financially attractive as well, and that's where I think the taxing pollution and not people is coming in as a potential option.
Absolutely. So I guess if I'm hearing you both correctly, then on the one side, it's about sharing knowledge between the different actors and kind of creating standardized approaches and methodologies to make sure everyone is being measured in the same way. And then ultimately actually also to move towards taxation in order to create the right kinds of incentives to make sure we're pushing everyone in the same direction, I guess. Do any of the other panelists have any additional thoughts?
One idea potentially that the governments could do is to help us get around collaboration in competitive spaces. So coming up with non-competitive spaces for businesses to work together. Some industries find it very challenging to work together, but we're all tackling the same problems. So I think there's a space for government to create that neutral ground.
Absolutely. So kind of identifying those pre-competitive spaces and nurturing and fostering those, which is something that, although many organizations strive to work in that pre-competitive space, it does seem more challenging in practice sometimes than it perhaps should be, or than we'd like to strive for. So I'm conscious of time, and we've had so many excellent questions come in. So what I'll do is jump straight into some of the questions that have come in from the chat box. As we ask these questions, please, for all the listeners, feel free to continue adding questions in the chat box. We will do our best to get through as many of those today, and we'll also follow up in the event that we are not able to answer all the questions during the session. So the first question, and I've kind of consolidated them a little bit. So for those who have submitted questions, thank you for submitting detailed questions. I hope that some of these questions that I'm sharing will help reflect your perspectives. There's been quite a lot of questions about data. In particular, one listener has asked Louise where exactly or how you share, or can you share where the data comes from that you use and track? And for Morten, can you share very practically how you track improved renewable energy with suppliers? Louise?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So as in are we thinking environmental data? I'll presume we're talking about environmental data. So yeah, the Engage to Reduce program, which I didn't talk about in depth because I was going sort of the step before, but when we have suppliers come in that we know are in that high risk A category, that's when we start to ask for data. And we actually use CDP as a standardized methodology for businesses to provide their data. And of course, I'm sure many of you know CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's because we had to choose a model that was standardized, similar to the Higg Index, that we want suppliers to only have to answer one response survey and use one methodology rather than continually asking them to report in different ways. So we've been using that model for the past 5 years, and that gives us that data. We take that data and then start to move it towards concrete actions that we ask suppliers to take. So then it starts to feed into what some of the other panelists were talking about. We use that and might say, okay, so we want you to commit to targets. We want you to move towards renewables. We'd like to see verified data, and we move them through a series of stages. But the baseline data all comes through CDP.
Great, thanks for that, Louise. And Morten, how do you track improvements with your suppliers?
So for us, it's very important that the supplier requests are as simple as it can get. So we do not embark on supply engagement platforms such as CDP or commodities or other you mentioned them, because we simply believe that we want action rather than understanding data and so on. So what we do is basically put out a request to suppliers: please integrate renewable power into your business. And we measure that and track that by knowing of course, they need to document that they have the renewable power certificates, where they're coming from, the amount of power generated from the specific facility in the certain region, and so on. And we also, of course, allow suppliers. Sometimes suppliers, they are bigger than us, so when we do not have the leverage to request that they need to have 100% renewable power, so they can only maybe meet our demand, let's say 10%, then they need to justify those 10%. Is that based on spend? Is that based on energy consumption on the sites, and so on? So 10% of the annual turnover, for example, needs to be proven and documented by the certificates.
Okay, well understood. And with regards to all these activities that the suppliers are doing on renewable energy, how much progress have you been able to track in your overall Scope 3 footprint through this approach?
Yeah, so good question. In terms of number of suppliers, we are pretty low. We are at, I think we are right now in terms of 40 out of 60,000 suppliers, so very low. However, these 40 suppliers are one of the crucial ones. So in terms of CO2 impact, we are progressing. I think we're 10% on our way. So pretty off to a good start, I would say. We have until 2030.
Sounds good. And I guess this comes down to that critical factor that we also heard from Louise of prioritizing suppliers, both in terms of their impact as well as their size and scope and importance to you. Great. We've had some interesting questions come in regarding transport-related emissions. So the first question is for Rebecca. Rebecca, you shared really interesting insights around going circular. And of course, when it comes to going circular, especially with regards to post-consumer circularity and recycling, transport-related emissions become a significant factor. And given that some of those garments are then sometimes shipped to faraway places in order to be recycled or upcycled, could you highlight the role of transport emissions and perhaps some thoughts you may have on how to optimize that and make sure that we're not, creating a new challenge where we're solving an old one? And then following up on that, perhaps Jatta, given how important transport emissions are for Posti, could you share some details on how you engage with transport suppliers to try to get them to improve their transport-related emissions in those instances where those service providers perhaps are not owned by Posti itself? Rebecca?
Yeah, thank you. So when it comes to circular models, we haven't modeled the kind of potential in regards to transportation and other factors yet. We are still experimenting with many of our suppliers on textile to textile recycling, and the recycling methods that we are using today is mainly using feedstock from PET bottles. That is quite well captured from an environmental footprint perspective, and there we know that we are lowering the total emissions. But so to answer the question on transportation, in our Scope 3, the transportation is contributing to around 4% tier 1 to store. That is not including transportation between the different facilities, but it's still highlighting that transportation is for sure not the largest chunk of carbon in our supply chain. The very high energy intensive manufacturing processes are contributing much more to that. But then of course, going circular, it's more about how can we keep the product alive for longer. So we will always promote repair and reuse in front of recycling, and the repair and reuse should ideally then be done on local markets and not shipping them to to Asia for repairing a zipper and then shipping them back. So that is, of course, not what we're looking at.
Sounds very good. Thanks for sharing, Rebecca. And Yatta, how do you see this for Posti?
Yeah, about the engaging suppliers, of course, we have also very different kind of suppliers in the different parts of the process. But there is different ways of engaging. Of course, we have some bigger partners that we work on, and then we can use the different purchasing models where we support renewables, etc. So there is quite many ways in a way affect. But as said, the collaboration and the partnership are the main themes for us, so that we don't just say that you have to do it, but we have some ways of doing it together. And that's maybe one of the things how to do it. But there is certain purchasing models that we use where we support the renewable part. And of course, with different partnerships, we have different ways of then thinking through this, how to get for the greener side.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We have a question coming in for Hannele about feedback that you may have received from customers on your CO2 ambition. So in which way have customers perhaps gotten excited or interested in your carbon strategy? That was a question that was raised by a listener for Hannele, but I would also like to take the opportunity after you have a chance to answer, Hannele, to also let some of the companies that have a B2C model, so actually Lego and Helly Hansen, for example, to share, because I think this is something that might differ between the B2B markets and the B2C markets. So Hannele, how have your consumers responded to your carbon strategy so far?
Thank you. So I think it's good to note that, yeah, we are a supplier as well, and we need the customer pressure to drive the work in our supply chain. And we see that there's a lot of interest in this issue. It's now within the last few years, it has been kind of like one of the main topics with our customers. And we have had quite good initiatives actually doing kind of like this value chain cooperation as well. So we're connecting our customers with our suppliers and having discussions on sustainability and also on climate issues. So yeah, to answer your questions, there is a lot of pressure and we thrive from that pressure, so to say.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I really think that in the B2B space as a supplier, it's we do see that, of course, large companies of all sectors are putting pressure on their suppliers. So it's great that you've been able to take that pressure, but then also catalyze action internally forward. Rebecca, how do you see this at Helly Hansen? And Louise, perhaps you can share a little bit from Lego's perspective as well, as I can imagine that your consumers are perhaps have a different perspective.
Yeah, and I definitely in the B2C market, having a climate strategy is almost becoming a kind of a license to operate. It's becoming a hygiene factor in our industry. If you don't have a climate strategy, you're not going to be relevant in a few years. So we are working very hard on developing our ambitious, realistic targets. We don't have those in place yet for climate. We have been more focused on rolling out the kind of demand for applying the Higg scoring and are looking at bringing 80% of our supply chain on board on that on the highest level. We are already on around 40%. But no, absolutely having a climate strategy, it's license to operate.
Yeah, and from Lego's perspective, actually, before I worked for Lego, I only worked for B2Bs. So it's quite a change because Lego's a family-owned company. We don't have investors. We're not under any of the kind of previous investor expectations that I used to be. We get a lot of interest from customers directly from children, actually. They write to us a lot and ask us to make improvements. But what's quite interesting is sometimes the improvements that customers and children ask us to make are different to those that could be to have the biggest impact. So we need to balance both, because carbon isn't as visible as, say, small plastic insert bags in a Lego box. And so the children write to us to get rid of the bags, they're single-use plastics. Of course, you know, that's something we want to do. But finding the right material for that is difficult, and we have started trialing that and moving to paper. But behind that was a lot of work and calculations about what material was the better material. Could we remove it entirely? And customers didn't want us to remove it entirely. So it's always a challenge between the very visible climate impacts that customers write to us about and actually properly tackling upstream carbon emissions, for example, which is not something that customers necessarily think about all that much. So yeah, they're very helpful, but also we have to bring our positions together.
Absolutely. So it's great to hear that children, our next generation, are actually engaging with you on the product, and that they are also excited about improved environmental performance. But you're absolutely right that, of course, perhaps those stakeholders don't yet know all about, where the biggest impact can be had. We've spoken a lot about engagement with Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, and I would like to ask the panelists also about engagement with your raw material suppliers. Is that something that you've been tackling, and what sorts of learnings might you be able to share for our listeners today? Okay, Morten, for me, you are all the way on the right-hand side, so I will cascade through the panelists.
Thank you. I was just about to preaching in. For us, we know that the raw material suppliers are actually one of the high impact suppliers in terms of CO2. So it's obvious for us to engage with them. Sometimes we interact directly, or more or less directly, Tier 1, Tier 2, with raw material suppliers. Sometimes the raw material suppliers are our tier, let's say, 4 in our supply chain, which makes it more difficult to engage with these suppliers. So again, it's back to the leverage. If we have any ability to influence that particular supplier and they have a high CO2 impact, we are doing it. Also, if it's not a direct supplier to Novo Nordisk, but if we don't have any possibility to do it, then I think we get we are using our resources better elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca.
Yeah, so for us, we are engaging with Tier 4 suppliers, but not so much on carbon. So we are engaging in regards to animal welfare. We have engaged a lot when it comes to sourcing of our down and wool. There we're going all the way back to the raw material, and also for cotton. Cotton is not so energy that is not the biggest risk, at least. Water and pesticide use is a much bigger risk there. And our scope 3 calculations, it also showed that the manufacturing part from Tier 2 and Tier 3 is a bigger chunk. So when it comes to the climate work, we will keep focusing on going deeper with Tier 2 and Tier 3 until we are fully engaging with Tier 4.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Louise.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, we're quite lucky in that some of our Tier 1 are raw materials. So that's really obviously very helpful for us because we do most of our own manufacturing. It gets a bit more complicated with the cardboard boxes, and there we do go to Tier 3, and one of the ways we've tried to tackle that is by working with companies that have the direct connection to mills and then direct connections to where the sort of materials are coming from, so that we've got the same connections and we're not starting to move it around. So what tends to happen there is that gets managed at a much more local level. So this is where the global procurement and the local procurement become separated, because to get those in-depth conversations with Tier 2 and Tier 3, we work with businesses that do all the stages of the preparation of the cardboard in single locations to try and keep that manageable, because otherwise it just gets very challenging. And we do have some parts of our supply chain, only small parts, so they're relatively low impact, but sometimes the little capes that you might find on a Lego minifigure are made by a different company, and then we do start to lose some of that visibility. So as much as possible, we manufacture everything ourselves.
Great, thanks for that. Hannele, I guess for you, what would be considered raw materials and Tier 4 suppliers for many companies is actually closer to your business. Do you have any insights to share?
So of course we have forest as our main raw material, and there we have a lot of our own forest resources also. But then thinking about the traditional sourcing and our direct raw material suppliers, a lot of chemical suppliers. And there it has helped a lot that we do quite detailed scope 3 calculations from where we know which are the biggest impact chemicals. Then we can target kind of like R&D substitution work based on that. And we're asking quite detailed information then, like these life cycle assessments from cradle to cradle analysis to get the data from the supplier and the input from their raw materials also. So we're working with that on quite a detailed level with our raw material suppliers, definitely.
Excellent. And Jatta, how do you see that from Posti's perspective?
Yeah, of course, for us it's a bit different game because we are not producing products, but of course we are using a lot of fuels in the transportations, and we are not directly, of course, some of the providers or companies we are working with are also the manufacturers, but not going into the raw materials as such. But from the other materials side, we are not using that much raw materials, so that we haven't highlighted as the main focus area for us, at least not yet.
Okay, very good. I'd like to briefly check in with Marie because I am conscious of our timing, and we were initially planning to close out around 11:30, although we have some flexibility. Marie, how do you see things?
I think we could do one final questions if our panelists are willing to stay another minute and then close off.
Okay, let me just check through our quick list of questions. So many good questions. It's very difficult to choose. Perhaps one question to all the panelists. So achieving science-based targets and achieving any kind of climate targets is incredibly challenging. Do you have any final words of advice for our listeners on what to do in order to really, make material progress and be able to track that in a good way? So we've had a number of questions on really how do you actually follow up and follow through and track and monitor those results. This time I'll start with Jatta. Can you share any last words of wisdom and advice for our listeners today?
Of course, as I said in my presentation, we have just completed our new baseline for the scope 3, and we did quite thorough analysis. So I think that's of course the first step, that you really understand what are the emission sources and the relevant categories for you to be focusing on, and that's also a requirement from the Science-Based Target Initiative. So you have to, in a way, know what are the emission sources and where you are working, and of course after that you should be prioritizing and setting the KPIs and targets, and we have started with our own part, and now next step for us is to then set the clear targets on the value chain part, and we are now actually working on that. So I think that's maybe my tip, to have very good visibility on what is the actual things and what are the weights and what is the importance, because you cannot do everything, so you have to prioritize, and that's how to go forward. And then I think I also agree that setting clear targets and not too many is the right way, so that you have very clarity on what is the main things to go forward with.
Great, thank you. Hannele.
Yes, so agree with the prioritization and thinking about the resources you have, and then aiming your actions based on that. So do you want to work with it's okay to work with like 10 strategic suppliers and doing work there and detailed work, or then doing work with the whole 20,000 suppliers, or do both, whichever is good, but kind of like just starting the work. I think that's the main thing. choose your battles and then just start to chop the elephant down.
Strategic and prioritizing.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Louise.
Yeah, of course I agree with prioritizing, because that was what I was talking about. But on top of that, I do think we're probably all on the panel in the small teams relatively to the size of the companies we work for. So I think upskilling procurement, particularly for Scope 3, is very important. The why and a little bit of the how. You know, I think we can talk a lot in language of Scope 3, and I've become pretty aware that actually most people that are not in sustainability won't know what a Scope 3 is. So starting to put that language across and getting everybody in the procurement team particularly, but across the company as well, to understand what we're talking about here and how they can impact it.
Sounds good. Rebecca.
Yeah, kind of echoing what has been said already. For us, it's much about focusing on the key suppliers, consolidate our materials with those key suppliers in order to also kind of incentivize the good work they do. And I think also engaging them. We are working a lot with engaging the suppliers so that they also motivated to why they should do this work. So it's not only coming as a requirement for doing business, it's actually a benefit for them. So having this kind of close partnership and dialogue in your supply chain is, I think, really key to be successful here.
Very good. And Morten.
Yes, of course, I agree with the prioritization of suppliers, but I think we should be very wise in terms of prioritization of our resources when it comes to spending it on understating data or spending it on actually implementation of good CO2 reductions in supply chain. So we have taken a very pragmatic approach. We are not measuring that much. We're not following up on a lot of things and requesting data. We're basically just implementing a lot. So that gives more results, but of course, you can say the flip side of that is that you don't have a clear track record, so to say.
Very good. Focus is key. Fantastic. All right. Given the time constraints, I'll wrap this out now. I'd like to invite you all to get in touch with our team if you have any further questions or further interest in the topic. We're always here to try to facilitate the discussions and connect you with our panelists and other relevant people in the sustainability community. So we look forward to hearing from you. And without further ado, I would like to give a big round of applause and thank you for our panelists today. You made for a very dynamic and engaging discussion, and we really appreciated to hear all of your insights, learnings, and strategies to make the world a better place. And finally, I'd like to invite you to follow other South Pole events in the future. We have a regular ongoing event series called Climate Chatter and also other webinars that we host from time to time, including others with the Nordic Platform. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. And Marie, over to you for final words.
Yes, no, also from my side, a big thank you, especially to the panelists, and wishing you a lovely day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.